So you may remember, of course, not too long ago, there was the big hubbub about Lee Anderson defecting to Reform. And one of the things that was heavily implied, or at least Richard Trice tried to heavily imply, we don't know how true exactly this is, but I wouldn't suspect it's not too far from the truth, that he had been having other conversations with other Tory MPs who also might want to maybe come on over to Reform. Um, so far, that really hasn't happened. But I will say this now: never say never. I maybe you might see one or two. I would be very shocked if there isn't maybe another one or two, especially if things continue this way in the current Tory party. I mean, you've had the Daily Mail literally come out, I think, this morning saying like Penny Mordaunt is our only hope. Time to ditch Rishi and back Penny. So there's going to be now a lot of pressure coming from the Daily Mail, especially to ditch Rishi and to put in Mordaunt. And it would not surprise me, especially in the light of the local elections, to see that call amplified even more. But once again, well worth reminding you, Penny Mordaunt herself coming out saying, "This is nothing to do with me. I've got nothing to do with this. I'm being put as a head of a campaign that I do not want to take place." So we'll see what happens there on that front. But defections to Reform, the reality of that is that has been happening really for well over a year at this point. You just probably haven't seen it. In my own local area, there is there was a Brexit party candidate, as they were originally. He then switched to Conservative after that election. And then, when things started going bad for the Conservatives, he then switched back to Reform. And bear in mind, this is a continuing pattern that has not happened in my own hometown. This has happened all over the country. It just hasn't been reported because, low level council candidates switching like that unfortunately just does not get reported. But one switch that has sort of been reported but not really too much is the mayoral candidate for Manchester. He defected recently from the Tories to Reform. And bear in mind, not big, not massive news, but in reality is the defections, especially for local candidates, regional candidates, has actually been quite significant. Um, that has happened. But MPs, only Anderson so far. We haven't seen anyone else follow suit. But as they say never. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe another one or two of those red wall MPs decide, well, actually, I'm going to lose anyway if I'm a Conservative. Might as well roll the dice with the Reform. Who knows? But like I say, we'll wait and see what happens there on that front. But we're going to go cover this because I think it's something that does deserve to be covered, I think, a bit more in detail because on a local level, this is actually happening quite a lot. Quite a lot. And it is all from people who used to be part of the Brexit party, then became Conservative, and are now switching back to Reform. So we'll see what happens on this front. But before we do get into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link where you can buy me coffee. There is the YouTube thank you button. And of course, there's the Pony Club down below as well. All links down below in the doobly-doo. And of course, we've got my wonderful little scrolly thing going across there as well. So let's go cracking on into this. This comes from Politics Home with title of Tory Manchester Mayoral Candidate Defects to the Reform Party. So Dan Barker, a Conservative activist from Sale, was selected as the Tory candidate back in December of 2023. The Reform Party has now confirmed that he will now stand as its candidate in the Manchester mayoral election that will take place on the 2nd of May. A source close to the Greater Manchester Conservatives said that Barker had not been meeting the, quote, criteria they expected of him. So there's now, or at least the Conservatives are now trying to put forward over the idea that, oh, he really wasn't meeting the criteria. But he'd already been selected as your candidate, and this to me reeks of, oh well, the reality was we were gonna, ditch him anyway, change for someone else. But you've already done that. You've already made that selection. But there you go. Anyway, Politics Home understands that Laura Evans has now been selected as the new Tory mayoral candidate for Greater Manchester. Evans was the party candidate for mayor when the position was last contested in 2021. She received 19.16% of the vote, coming second to Labour's Andy Burnham, who won on 67% of the vote. Reform received less than just 3%. But the new polling released today by YouGov did show that the Tory support had fallen below 20% for the first time since Rishi Sunak took over as Prime Minister, with 44% of respondents saying they intended to vote Labour. Reform was at 14% and only 5 points behind the party now in the opinion polls. The Reform spokesperson said that Dan has realised the way that Tories treat their candidates is a way that they treat the country, with contempt, and he wants to represent the ordinary men and women in Manchester, and Reform is the only game in town. But there you go. And of course, the backbiting started almost immediately, because this then comes out saying a Conservative parliamentary candidate said, I congratulate Dan on going from being guaranteed to lose because of mediocrity to being doubly guaranteed to lose because of his untrustworthiness. I like that. That they've gone out and said that, because I don't know how people would feel, and how honestly you should trust any of these candidates, especially local candidates. Bear in mind, this is an upcoming mayoral election, and I would ask, if you do have a candidate who has done the whole, switcheroo, I would ask them, how can you trust them to remain in that party? How do you know that they're not going to go independent or another party? How can you then guarantee? And bear in mind, rules on local politics allow them to do that. I don't think that should be the case. I always think that if someone does switch parties, it should sort of trigger a by-election. I don't think it's fair on the people that constituency, or even in that that councillors sort of patch, as they sort of call it. Is fair either to people that constituency. I do think that should trigger a by-election. But anyway, so if Barker is, of course, unsuccessful in his Manchester mayoral election, he's expected to stand for the Reform at the next general election, which is due to be called before the end of the year. Barker has not met the Reform leaders yet, Richard Trice yet, but they have spoken on a number of occasions. The new Manchester mayoral candidate is expected to make a speech in Salford on Sunday, where he set out the party's campaign. What attracted Barker to Reform, apparently, is the pledge to scrap net zero. When he was the Conservative candidate, he criticised the clean air zone, which he described as, quote, a Trojan horse for the ULEZ expansion in Manchester. For a while, he is also very sympathetic to its pledge for lower taxes to support small businesses and defence. Again, I don't know how lower taxes does help support small businesses and defence, but there you go. He's clearly feeling liberated. He can finally say what he thinks and do what he says, which was what he's trying to follow. The vagaries of the different current Conservative Party is very hard, Reform Token has said. The Tories now have 14 days to select a candidate for the Manchester mayoral election. Tory source said the Conservatives relieved of the 20% of the vote in Manchester 2021. We have to be realistic about our prospects in the election and allocate resources accordingly, which is basically, if we do select a candidate, realistically, they're not going to get too much support. But there you go. A spokesperson for Burnham said that defection to Reform did signal the collapse in the Tory party in Greater Manchester. The former Tory party candidate is now jumping off the sinking ship to try and bid to save his career. But voters in Greater Manchester are not impressed by those who put personal ambition and party politics before our place, he said. Whilst the Tories and Reform do head for civil war, Annie will continue to take the place first, rather than the first approach on delivering for all voters and all parties, bringing it together and leading the way for Greater Manchester. Yeah, Would not surprise me if there were more in the future. Would not surprise me if there were more in the future. Um, Certainly, defections at a local level is quite common, and like I say, been happening since last year. Been happening heavily since last year, especially local councillors. And again, don't tend to get too much news. It might just tend to happen, and it might maybe get picked up in your local paper. Maybe your like local like Labour Party, Conservative, Lib Dems, whatever party might post about it on their social media. Do you know that this candidate switched to Reform, etc. But other than that, it does not get a lot of attention. The fact that these very low level defections have been happening for well over a year. Obviously, Anderson was the first significant one to move across. Uh, will some more join him? I don't know, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. It might happen. If it does, I expect it to be maybe just like one or two extra, basically to try and, I don't know, out of pure desperation to try and save themselves. Because after all, if you're going to lose, if you're looking at the polls, you can clearly see that Rishi Sunak has abandoned any form of red wall strategy whatsoever. What have you got to lose by jumping on the Reform bandwagon? So we'll see what happens, but as in the severity of defections, probably, of course, Anderson is probably the most significant, but this is maybe the next sort of significant in terms of defections. But trust me, a lot of councillors have defected or redefected because they were, like I say, started off as Brexit Party, then went to Conservative, then flipped back now to Reform. That has happened quite a lot. Hasn't had a lot of news coverage, but hey, that's just been the case going on. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.